Welcome, everybody. I am David Cormier, the managing editor and production editor at CAIS. We are sitting down today with the 2023 Paul Gray Award winner, Matthew McCaffrey of Manchester University, to talk about his paper, Loot Boxes, Problem Gambling, and Problem Gaming, a critical review of the emerging literature. So, Matthew, this is a literature review and a certain type of literature review. So if you would just tell the viewers, what is a literature review in general, and what is your specific type of review that you did for this paper? Because it is a very powerful paper and very thought-provoking, and that's why it won the award. And it's a literature review. So please, would you tell the viewers a little bit about what a literature review is and about your specific type?
Of course. Well, thank you very much, obviously, first of all, for having me and for taking such an interest in the paper. Now, a literature review is an attempt to systematically describe a body of work, a body of research that's been done on a particular topic. And as you can imagine, the literature reviews, they come in all different shapes and sizes, depending on things like how long a topic has been studied, or how and just the sheer amount of research that's been put into it. So with a topic like the one that I addressed in my paper, it's a relatively new research area, and so one of the implications of that is that in trying to review this literature, as it says in the title, it's an emerging literature. So it's limited to let's say fewer than 100 papers at the moment. So one of the challenges with that is to sort of figure out exactly what the scale and the scope of the research that's been done is, and also, of course, figure out what the conclusions are that the literature has been reaching, and if there's an emerging consensus on the main issues and that kind of thing. So it was it's a very specific kind of literature that I was reviewing, and so I needed to take a rather specific approach to it. And so what I did was I conducted what's called a hybrid review, which combines elements of a couple of different types of literature review. So on the one hand, it's a scoping review, which is a way of conducting a review where the literature is new and it's not really clear what the relevant research questions are or what the best methods for studying them are. So you really need to, as the name implies, kind of scope things out and figure out what is the literature, what are its boundaries, what's being talked about, what's not being talked about, and all of that. So that's part of it. And then the hybrid part is that it's also a critical review. And a critical review, as the name implies, is a review that takes a critical eye with regard to work that has been published. And so not just examining things like gaps in the literature, but also looking at the quality of data and the quality of the logical arguments that are being made, trying to figure out whether the interpretations of the data are accurate, and so on. So by bringing these two things together, I think I was able to address sort of an emerging literature, but that's also a somewhat difficult one simply because it's so new. So that's what I was going for with this hybrid critical scoping review.
So just a quick follow-up. When an emerging conversation is new, what are some of the challenges of reviewing the literature? Are there unique challenges that go along with reviewing emerging conversations?
Absolutely. So just to give you a couple of examples, on the one hand, in the early days of this literature, like the literature on loot boxes, there are many, many different kinds of sources to consider. Typically with a well-developed literature, you know where to find the academic literature. You know that it's published in certain journals, maybe it's in a field or a whole discipline or something like that. So it's a lot easier to identify all the relevant sources. These emerging literatures are a little bit different, though, because you have some academic work being done, but then also you have policy papers being written, and you have briefs from governments or regulatory bodies, all kinds of different people sort of contributing to these conversations, including the public, including journalists, and so on. So it's a little more challenging to figure out what to include and what not to include, and what sort of research should ultimately make the cut. So that's one of the problems. Another big problem is that relates to sort of research methods, because because it's so new, people haven't yet figured out what the best ways to address some of these questions are. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to figure out just what the questions are to begin with, but then also to figure out how best to approach answering them. So that's another big challenge. And that was another reason why I took a critical approach in my literature review, because as I discovered when I started reading this literature, there were a lot of sort of issues to come to terms with, and a lot of ways in which, I think future work could really be improved.
Mm. Is there, you think about like a literature that focuses on emerging conversation, and you think about a literature review that focuses on established conversation. And you think about the value of the two. I would imagine, and I'm just giving you an opportunity, that literature reviews on emerging conversations are actually more interesting and more valuable than literature reviews on existing established conversations. What are your thoughts on that?
I would certainly say so, because as valuable as talking about established themes is, already we have sort of a common language for talking about them. We kind of know a little bit better what's at stake and what we're talking about, and what the boundaries of the conversation are, and so on. So those kind of reviews are valuable, but they tend to have a much more narrow purpose. You read them just so you can remember or figure out what the key citations are, where the conversation's up to, and so on. But they're, I think they tend to be a little more sort of straightforward. Whereas the emerging conversations, I think, are more exciting because nothing's set in stone yet, because there isn't a general sense of what to talk about, what not to talk about, what the best methods are, what we've concluded, and so on. It's all in flux. It's all constantly moving and changing. And that, in my view, is the best time to sort of jump into this conversation. And again, that's why I chose to write this literature review, is because I thought it was really the best time, and it was sort of urgently needed to talk about these things right now.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that that was one of the things that made your paper so interesting to me as a reader, and to the editorial board, is that I think we're all surprised by the confusion and the inconsistency, the lack of established data, and all of the things that you note in your delightful paper. We were all pretty surprised, and that, Matthew, was thought-provoking, and I think that's just valuable research. Now, can you talk a little bit about studying gaming, studying loot boxes, studying gambling and problem gaming? I imagine that's a hard field to study, and I'm just thinking on my mind, just the dynamics of it, and the closed nature of a lot of the technology, and the private nature of the companies that are putting this out. Can you talk a little bit about sort of some of the challenges that just go along with studying gaming in the gaming industry?
Sure. So gaming, as I think you indicated, is very interesting, but it's also a big challenge to study sometimes. And one of the reasons is that it's an industry that's constantly immersed in one controversy after another, and there are so many different opinions, and people have so many different intuitions about what's going on and what the problems are and how the industry could be better, and so on. So one basic challenge is just to even just approach this, from a sort of a calm and objective standpoint, and not get sucked into the controversy, into the rhetoric, and so on, and just look at it as social scientists or what have you. So that by itself, I think, is a big challenge. At the same time, also, as you mentioned, I think there are specific things about the game industry that make it quite difficult. For example, there's not a lot of readily available data, and especially in things like loot boxes, the kind of data that we need, information about player behavior and the way that players interact with games, the way that players make purchases, and so on. There's a lot of information that's required to really get into these questions, and it's not information that's either publicly available, or in some cases it simply doesn't exist, or really isn't being tracked by anybody in a reliable way. So that in itself is a huge barrier to understanding these kind of issues and learning more about them.
And I think too, when we're talking about the gaming industry, at least for me as somebody who doesn't really study it, but engages in it, at different levels, is the magnitude and scope of gaming is huge. It's just every household you walk into, there's going to be a game somewhere.
Absolutely.
And for a media that permeates society so thoroughly, there's a lack of conversation. There's a lack of research. And it's dynamic. It's constantly changing. We can't even pin it down long enough to talk about it.
It's so true. And especially with again, just emphasizing this particular controversy again, there was a big public outcry starting a few years ago about loot boxes, and lots of people were concerned for many different reasons. But even by the time the sort of academic wheels started turning and people started putting out research and so on, even within that time, the industry was already beginning to change substantially. And in some cases, you had lots of different companies who, in response to public outcry, started removing loot boxes or changing the mechanics to make them less controversial, or making plans for future games not to include them, and so on. So there was a lot of reaction, and that's happening on the one hand. At the same time, new technologies are developing, new business models and revenue models. Companies are trying to figure out different ways to keep generating revenue and so on. So already, even just within the space of a few years, by the time sort of academics reacted, people in the business world had reacted, I think, much more quickly than that. And of course, that just goes to show that the bottom line is significant, right? And if a public controversy is hurting your bottom line, you're going to do something about it pretty quick. Whereas doing really good, thorough academic research, sad to say, that does take a long time.
And the gaming industry has the revenue to insulate itself to the point where, yes, they look at the bottom line. They think, well, we may be losing money on loot boxes. We have the R&D resources. We're just going to go do something else. And they can just move that quickly. And it's hard for us to keep up with it. I think that's, going back to your paper, that's what we need, are these kinds of things to say, this is what we don't know, people. This is what we don't know. Because, man, people just are not aware of how little they really understand about the gaming industry, its scope, its magnitude, and the technology associated with it, which I thought your paper just really brings to the surface so well. Now, Matthew, could you tell us, is there anything new in terms of research on loot boxes since your publication, or any new policies or regulations that have been implemented since then? Could you please update our viewers a little bit on where the conversation stands now?
Sure. So since the paper came out, there have been a few new studies. Unfortunately, some of them are very similar to some of the ones that I discussed in my paper, and about which I made some critical arguments. So in some sense, there hasn't been a lot of progress. However, I will say that there has been more attempt by some scholars to start thinking about ways in which loot boxes are unique. Because one of the criticisms I made is that loot boxes are very often studied using these tools, these research tools that were developed 30, 40 years ago to study almost completely different problems, right? And obviously that is an issue, because you can't, basically what this involves is starting out researching loot boxes, but it starts out by kind of assuming what you need to prove by using these tools that were originally developed to study things like traditional gambling in casinos and things like that. You can't just assume that those tools are appropriate for this new kind of work. So one thing I will say is that there have been some positive first steps taken towards developing tools that are actually uniquely designed to study loot boxes and that don't bias the investigation right from the start by assuming exactly what they need to prove. So that's encouraging, and that is a positive first step. Of course, these things, they do take a long time. Again, good, thorough research, it does not happen overnight, sadly, but they're positive first steps, and it's good that somebody's taking them, right? Mm-hmm. So that is encouraging. On the regulatory side of things, there are ongoing investigations. Very often we find that whether it's whether they have a positive or a negative view. Regulators can often be sort of slow to act or slow to express an opinion, which in some cases is a good thing, because you don't want them rushing around and just and following every public outcry and so on. That's dangerous. But so there hasn't been a lot of new regulation, but we have seen some things that are very much related to loot boxes. For example, there's been an increase in some regulations related to labeling, how games are labeled, some new regulations about how games can be advertised. So, for instance, if loot boxes are offered within games, now there are now certain labels that in different countries that are required that say something like either it includes in-game purchases or includes sort of randomized purchases or something to that effect. So there's been some small developments there. Recently, there hasn't been a lot of large-scale regulation, and I think one of the reasons for that is because I think everybody's sort of holding off until the base of evidence is bigger and stronger and so on, and so that there's just more evidence to sort of point us in the right direction.
Thank you, Matthew. That was delightful, insightful, and useful and practical, and just like your paper. So thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your paper. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much once again. It's a great honor to receive the award, and I'm just happy that people are taking an interest in the paper and are willing to explore this issue a little bit further, because like I was saying, it's in the early stages. And more than anything, what we need right now is to have a very serious conversation about what we know and what we don't know. And, hopefully all of us, myself included, approach this kind of topic with a spirit of humility, which, we're sad to say, academics, we don't always have. So, but thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.